Shana Tova once again, and once again thank you for welcoming me into your homes and allowing us to celebrate Rosh Hashana together. On Rosh Hashana, we pray for God's attribute of mercy to be reawakened so that we can be blessed with a good future. I would suggest that humanity needs to reawaken its attribute of mercy no less. On May 25th, 2020, at around 8 p.m., a 46-year-old black man went to a convenience store to buy a pack of cigarettes. He allegedly used a fake $20 bill, and the police were called. When the suspect was already handcuffed and sitting inside the police cruiser, a white male police officer yanked him out of the car, put him face down on the pavement, and knelt on his neck for 7 minutes and 46 seconds until he had killed him. During this time, he repeatedly said he couldn't breathe, called for his mama, and said, "Please don't kill me." Bystanders tried to intervene and were threatened by the officer with mace and pushed away by the officer's accomplices. The kneeling officer has now been charged with second-degree murder, and the other 3 officers have been charged with aiding and abetting second-degree murder. The public outcry was rightly quick to follow. Protests began throughout the world, including here in Hamilton. George Floyd's murder at the hands of a police officer is not unique by any means. In March in Louisville, a black woman named Breonna Taylor was shot and killed in her home when plainclothes officers broke in after midnight without even knocking or identifying themselves. She was a 26-year-old emergency medical technician with no criminal record, and there are plenty more stories like this one. A week after George Floyd's murder on June the 1st, the President of the United States arranged for police officers to use tear gas and violently clear away protesters so that he could walk to a church to take some pictures of him holding a Christian Bible. His action was condemned worldwide as excessive and a violation of protesters' human rights and American First Amendment right of free speech. The next day, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was asked by a CBC reporter what he thought of Trump's actions. Prime Minister Trudeau seemed unprepared for the question and spent a long 21 seconds in silence, awkwardly smiling at the cameras as the country waited for his answer. Finally, after 21 seconds, he said, "We all watch in horror and consternation what's going on in the United States. It is a time to pull people together, but it is a time to listen. It is a time to learn what injustices continue despite progress over years and decades." He then added, "There is systemic discrimination in Canada, which means our systems treat Canadians of color, Canadians who are racialized, differently than they do others." Here in Canada, we see black people being shot and killed by police too. We see this disparity even more with Indigenous people. More than 40% of those shot and killed by police are Indigenous. Trudeau was pressured to explain why he wouldn't directly comment on Trump's actions. Trudeau said, "My job as a Canadian Prime Minister is to stand up for Canadians, to stand up for our interests, to stand up for our values." One political analyst, University of Toronto professor Nelson Wiseman, commented, "Canada gains nothing by explicit criticism of an American president." Judaism begs to differ. "Do not despise your sibling in your heart. You must rebuke your peer, or you will be responsible for their sin." Leviticus 19:17. That's if all we can do is call them out for their wrongdoing. If we can do something to prevent the wrongdoing or its consequences, we are obliged to do so under the law. "Do not stand in your neighbor's blood," which is in the same chapter, verse 16. Leaders have an even greater responsibility to uphold these fundamental rules. Silence will be interpreted as approval. Others will learn that it is acceptable to behave that way. Moses never remained silent or inactive when he saw injustices. This was his trademark, the quality that set him on the path to become our leader. When he saw an Israelite slave being beaten by an Egyptian master, he defended the Israelite slave. When he saw two Israelites fighting, he intervened. When he saw male shepherds mistreating female shepherds, he intervened. Later, when Israel had betrayed God in the worst possible way, building the golden calf, and God decided to destroy them and rebuild Israel from Moses' descendants alone, Moses intervened and defended Israel from God. He demanded God forgive them and threatened to quit the Torah completely if God didn't listen. If you do not forgive them, he said, I ask that you erase me from your book. Amazingly, Moses wasn't even afraid to stand up to God when defending Israel. Importantly, disobeying God by hitting instead of speaking to the rock got him punished, but questioning God's decisions on moral grounds did not get him punished. It would seem that God actually welcomes feedback from faithful humans. Abraham too questioned God's decision to destroy Sodom, and God delayed its destruction until Abraham got his chance to argue his case. Earlier this summer, I read an article in which a Rabbi Mark Angel pointed out that there is something drastically missing in the Moses story in the Torah. Moses always stood up for others and defended them. The Israelites knew this. Why didn't anyone stand up for him? In Rabbi Angel's words, why do we hear nothing at all about the Israelites' reaction to God's decree? Why didn't they pray on behalf of their faithful leader? Why didn't they announce to God that they themselves would not enter the promised land unless Moses were allowed to enter with them? Why was there no expression of loyalty to or empathy with Moses? After all that Moses had done for them, it would seem obvious that the people of Israel would have sought God's mercy and kindness to their leader and teacher, but there is no record of their concern at all. He explained it with a Judeo-Spanish expression, one with a full stomach does not understand the pain of the one who is hungry. He writes, the Israelites had wandered for 40 years. They were anxious to get into the promised land. Their focus was on their own needs. They did not think much about the feelings of Moses. After all, if God judged that Moses should not enter the land, then so be it. They didn't have time or interest to create a stir. They wanted to move forward with or without Moses didn't really matter very much. It wasn't that the Israelites were bad people. No, they were simply normal people who wanted to get on with their lives. They used Moses as long as he was available. When he could no longer deliver them goods and services, they turned their thoughts to the next leader and to their future journeys. This treatment of Moses might remind us of the Breonna Taylor murder, which, unlike George Floyd's, drew very little public outcry. She was a black woman who worked to serve others as an EMT. As with Moses, perhaps with people like Breonna, society tends to use them as long as possible and then move on to the next one. Rabbi Angel writes that the apathetic treatment Moses got was completely natural, yet deplorable, and that we ought to expect much more of ourselves. Though I think there's a lot of truth in his interpretation, I think there's more to the story than that. It's likely that many Israelites were disturbed and wanted to see Moses lead them into the land, but they were afraid to speak up about it. The problem was that they had their own dark history with God. They had angered God many times in the desert, even causing God to cancel plans to bring the Exodus generation into the land of Israel and instead only welcome in their children. Finally, they were going to enter. They would have liked to plead for Moses, but not at the cost of their own success. The Torah seems to indicate that more Israelites mourned the death of Aaron, Moses' brother, than the death of Moses himself. Perhaps, in part, this was due to their shame and embarrassment of not being able to do enough to help him. Aside from Moses, one of our other high holiday biblical heroes is Abraham. We reference his willingness to sacrifice his son on God's orders, considered the ultimate self-sacrifice, since he had so desperately wanted and needed a son. We ask that his extraordinary merit be extended to us, and we ask God to remember how Abraham, quote, conquered his mercy to do your will. In return, may your mercy conquer your anger with us. It is a somewhat peculiar phrase which seems to indicate that perhaps God's anger would be more natural than God's mercy, in the same way that Abraham would have naturally been more inclined to spare rather than slaughter Isaac. This doesn't fit our understanding of a benevolent, merciful God who is constantly cautioning us to look out for the poor and the weak and not to wrong one another. Perhaps underlying this phrase is another human nature that we all too often succumb to, one in which we also conquer our mercy, but not for a good reason like Abraham. We would like to speak up. We would like to step up and help, but we are afraid of how this might affect us. The more we do this, the easier it gets to ignore our natural, merciful tendency. Our Jewish traditions are here to remind us never to do so, to never remain silent, to never fail to lend a helping hand out of fear. Sometimes self-improvement means learning new, better methods to accomplish good. Other times, self-improvement means learning to ignore the distractions and just listen to our instincts. Let this coming year be one in which this is what we do. Let us return to our roots, because our roots are good. Shana Tova.